Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ian Campbell. I'm Vice President of Operations at PACICC. I am the staff lead for the Risk Officers Forum, and I'm your host for this afternoon's broadcast. Welcome, everyone. I think we had about 160 plus registrants from 60 organizations right across Canada. So welcome, lots of new first timers. A special welcome to you. This is our final webinar of 3 in 2024. And thank you to my colleague, Danica Hall, Manager of Operations. She's working behind the scenes to make sure that everything goes smoothly today. So we encourage you to relax, enjoy the next 90 minutes of discussion. We have some really interesting information to share with you. And I'm going to ask Danica if you could put up, this is our agenda for today. I'm going to review quickly some housekeeping items. We'll then move to our presentation. We'll end the broadcast with a look at our final Risk Officers Forum meeting of 2024. And then I'll remind you that there's going to be a satisfaction survey issued tomorrow, and your questions or your comments and feedback certainly help to shape the next broadcast. So thanks in advance for that. Each year or every second year, we do an enterprise risk management survey of members, and we ask them risk issues that they're looking at in the next 1 to 3 years in the short term, and in the next 3 to 10 years in the long term. And environment and hazardous chemicals came up as a short-term issue in our 2023 ERM survey. So we're looking further into that. We have joining us today, I'm going to finish my housekeeping items. We are using the MS Teams broadcast, and you'll note on the taskbar on the top, the chat and the Q&A. We want this to be an interactive broadcast, so we're going to ask you to please give your questions and comments in real time and use the chat and the Q&A. And then we'll pose those to our speakers. And antitrust compliance is in effect. The Competition Act is in full effect. You are competitors and remain competitors throughout the broadcast. We are recording this webinar. That will be made available on our website shortly. And the slide deck, we wanted to have you focus on the presentation today. We're going to share the slides with you in a follow-up note to all members. Okay, our speakers. Very pleased to have with us Greg Gaines, Technical Director, Economic and Complex Analytics Practice at Roux Inc., and his colleague, Dr. Chase Gerbig, Principal Engineer at Roux Inc. So in the notes, the invitation sent out on the webinar, I noted that Roux Inc. is a U.S. environmental and consulting management firm providing advisory and regulatory and field services. Greg came to our attention. He authored an article in August 2024 in the Environmental Claims Journal, Are PFAS the Next Asbestos? How and why the emergence of PFAS as a mass tort could impact the insurance industry. And he noted that U.S. state and federal regulatory bodies have designated PFAS as a hazardous substance. It's resulted in lots of lawsuits, PFAS affecting organizations that use PFAS in their products and or operations. There was a settlement with DuPont, Greg's probably going to touch on, and Chase, DuPont settled with over 3,500 claimants for $671 million in 2017. It is the subject of extensive ongoing litigation. It's been likened to asbestos litigation, the longest mass tort to date in the US. And so I'm going to throw over to our speakers and welcome them. And they have a very extensive slide presentation to show you. And then we'll ask for your questions in real time, and we'll find points in the presentation to stop, interrupt, and field the questions. And so I throw it over to Chase and Greg. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect, thanks, Chase. So today we're going to be discussing clearly the emerging PFAS toxicant from a property damage and bodily injury exposure perspective in the United States. We're going to lay out for all of you the nature of PFAS, the types of claims that are being presented, and give you some claim insurance and litigation factors, issues that we think that should be considered by you as takeaways. As Ian said, we want this to be very interactive. We encourage questions. Feel free to use the chat feature or raise your virtual hand. If anyone has any questions, PFAS related at the advent, we'd be happy to talk about them right now. We're going to try to answer any and all questions from a professional perspective, but also mix in some of what you might be wondering for yourselves and your families, like, Do I need to throw away my Teflon pan? What's interesting is the answer to that really has implications on your professional involvement with PFAS, and they're really inextricably intertwined. So with that, please ask questions. As far as the Teflon pan, I believe Chase is going to be getting back to you later on with his answers on that. Next slide, Chase. So I was asked, well, actually, yeah, my apologies. I was looking at the wrong thing, but I was asked.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks. Roux was invited to present here because of my article in the Environmental Claim Journal, as Ian mentioned, Are PFAS the Next Asbestos? And we're going to be discussing various aspects of the article throughout the presentation. Just very briefly, PFAS has the potential to be the next asbestos. Potential. It has broad industrial and residential applications, and therefore we're going to be discussing the extremely large potential plaintiff pool that exists in the United States. Also, the public perception is driving this litigation. You've no doubt heard of forever chemicals. Those are PFAS. The media is reporting on PFAS heavily now. The science surrounding injury causation for PFAS is truthfully developing. It's, from my perspective, in its very early stages, but some research has at least initially indicated an association with certain PFAS exposures and certain malignancies. But the science is evolving as we speak. There are other mitigating factors that really aren't necessarily available in asbestos litigation, such as alternative causation theories. A lot of the alleged PFAS injuries, there are other causes of those injuries, and they can be argued that can make those cases defensible. So we hope to prepare you for PFAS when those issues come across your desk, and we're going to combine my legal and claims background and my colleague Chase's technical expertise. Like I said, highly encourage your involvement as we talk about PFAS. Next slide. So my name is Greg Gaines. I joined Roux in 2023 to provide claims administration, insurance audit, and litigation support services to the organization. I have about more years than maybe I want to admit, but about 30 years of experience in the insurance industry, primarily in the property and casualty claims and auditing spheres. Chase?
Thanks all. And I'm Chase Gerbig. So my background, I won't bore you with the resume. My background is sort of the scientific counterpart to Greg, right? Greg comes at it with a lot of insurance industry experience. I come at these issues from a geochemist and environmental engineer perspective. And really managing these issues sort of requires both perspectives. So what I'm going to do here is we haven't presumed folks know too much about PFAS, so I want to lay the groundwork a little bit. But let's sort of put the goal in mind here and think about sort of the extent of the liability. And Greg will go into more specifics, but the extent of the liability, at least as it's sort of manifest in the media. And Ian started us off with a really great description of really where we started. That DuPont $670 million settlement in the mid 2010s kicked off an enormous amount of PFAS related litigation, such that now within the last year or so, 3M has settled one particular large, but one particular case or subset of a case in a multi-district litigation in the state of South Carolina for about $10 billion. You throw in some other large contributors there, that single case will run $15 billion. And in fact, just today, what was it? Law 360 published an article about how 3M is now trying to roll up that liability and suing their excess insurers for coverage associated with that liability. So this is not just very real in terms of dollars. This is very real in terms of the insurance industry. But we're not just seeing it. That happened to be related to water contamination, but we're seeing PFAS in products. We're seeing PFAS in containers. We're seeing PFAS in firefighting foam. We're even seeing PFAS in sort of far-ranging things like the one in the middle here. Health Aid hit with a class action lawsuit claiming its kombucha is contaminated with or contains PFAS. So there are so many different angles and facets to this. Greg and I are approaching this really from a U.S. perspective. We think, to the extent that the Canadian perspective, is maybe not quite as mature as the U.S. sort of development of these issues, but we're aware across the world these issues are starting to come to the fore. So, as far as especially the science, I'm going to tell you about the science isn't going to change that much from place to place. Maybe the risk thresholds were, and then Greg will get into some of the liability issues. So the PFAS primer, we're going to talk about definitions, regulatory update, scope of liability here. And Greg teased this question. We really want to put this in the framework of how you're going to use this information day to day and how you're going to use it professionally. So the first question, do I need to worry about my Teflon pan? What's interesting about that question is it really speaks to the broader issues with PFAS and what is a PFAS compound and what risks are posed by PFAS compounds. And the reason that's important is because Teflon is technically a PFAS, but PFAS represents thousands of potential molecules. So what we have to keep in mind here is that although Teflon is PFAS, Teflon is not PFOS, which is down in the bottom left hand of your screen, that structure. That is sort of our prototypical environmental contaminant that is within the broader umbrella of PFAS. And there are a lot of molecules that look a lot like PFOS. But I'll tell you that the human health implications associated with PFOS and the molecules that look like PFOS are very different than Teflon, such that there really is very, very little evidence to suggest that Teflon is actually a risk to human health. It is a very stable, large polymeric molecule. Essentially, think of it like this. PFOS is sort of similar to vinyl chloride, your typical solvent site contaminant. Teflon is like polyvinyl chloride, PVC, right? PVC pipe, plastic pipe that we run water through all the time. So vinyl chloride, toxic. PVC pipe, not toxic. PFOS, potential toxicity. Teflon, very low toxicity. That said, if what you want to do is go home today and say, hey, listen, I heard at work today that Teflon is PFAS and I want to get rid of it and get new, stainless steel pans, go for it. That's a true statement. Just we have to not misconstrue the PFAS that we're worried about from an environmental and human health exposure context with the PFAS, things like Teflon. And that's brought home really to a point when we think about definitions of PFAS. In the middle here, we have the pharmaceutical Prozac, the antidepressant. And interestingly enough, even that might meet some definitions of a PFAS compound, but it is not what we think of as a PFAS compound in an environmental context. But when we step back and we think about these things, Teflon is actually an interesting example because it does have some of the properties of PFAS that we're most interested in. It's very, very stable in the environment. Maybe you've heard of, forever chemicals, and I don't like that term for a lot of reasons, but you may have heard of it. It also is very hydrophobic, that is, it repels water, and lipophobic, it repels oils, and that is characteristic of both the PFOS and the Teflon. They tend to exist at surfaces, and we'll talk about the industrial applications. But this idea of it sitting at surfaces is very, very important to us. But this idea is most important. If you take nothing away from this discussion, take away this. PFAS as a group are not a monolith. We have to think of them in terms of individual compounds. So when we talk about industrial uses, and this has a lot of implications, particularly in the States as our insurance policies have evolved. The different forms of PFAS have evolved over time in different industrial applications. So what you see on the bottom left is sort of a timeline. We've got on the left a bunch of different PFAS compounds, including PFOS and PFOA, the second and third ones down. And those are our sort of prototypical environmental contaminants. And those chemicals, we stopped using those in the early 2000s voluntarily for the most part. But what we did is we transitioned to other chemicals. We transitioned to things like fluorotelomeres and much more novel PFAS related compounds. And so we have to think about the fact that this has long industrial uses, but also broad industrial uses. So you can imagine that a chemical, broadly PFAS, that is good at being both hydrophobic, repelling water, and lipophobic, repelling oils, could have a lot of applications, right? Water resistant clothing, Gore-Tex jackets, really, really useful because they shed water. We used PFAS products in stain resistance in terms of things like carpets, right? If we want to Scotch guard our carpets, a product that historically contained PFAS, the reason we did that is that PFAS product coated the carpet fibers and prevented red wine or your kid's juice from soaking into the carpet. Similarly, eye makeup. There's a lot of personal care products with PFAS in them or had PFAS in them historically. And the value there is we prevent water from getting into mascara and then the mascara doesn't run. So lots of different applications of these particular class of compounds. And what happens is the evolution of those over time and the broad industrial applications has resulted in a lot of different exposures across sort of industry, across the environment. So again, we're going to take this back to the idea of I'm sure from a professional perspective, you're really interested in how to manage these liabilities, but I'm going to guess you're also interested in what operations in my town, what operations nearby my house, which ones do I need to worry about? And here the answer is maybe a little less optimistic than the Teflon pan answer. And that is that it's coming at us from a lot of different directions. So what this figure is showing is up here are residential homes, sort of the endpoint that we're most worried about in terms of exposures and liabilities. And where are PFAS coming from? At least environmentally, into those residential homes. We do hit on the idea that humans are exposed through a lot of non-environmental factors. But that's only sort of touched on here. This is really the environmental exposures, but keep this in mind. US EPA's risk assessment has assumed that only 20% of a typical residential exposure to PFAS is coming through drinking water exposures. The other 80% are coming through materials, food packaging, essentially non-environmental or non-drinking water issues. That said, I want to hit on sort of the idea that we've got within this diagram, we've got groundwater and river water on the bottom, right? This is sort of chemicals getting into our environment. And then on the right-hand side, those chemicals exposing people in residential homes to those chemicals. And we can see that on the left-hand side, we've got PFAS producing and using industries. That's probably not shocking. That's sort of our prototypical environmental contaminant source. But what happens here is we end up moving PFAS through a lot of other sources or a lot of other sort of points in the system. We move PFAS from industrial applications. Oftentimes they discharge their water to a wastewater treatment plant. That wastewater treatment plant generates sludges. Those sludges, sometimes they're land applied as biosolids. This is a common practice in the US. It's also a common practice in Canada. Those biosolids can contain significant quantities of PFAS. So what we've done in this scenario is we've moved PFAS from an industrial application all the way to essentially pristine farm fields. We're similarly disposing of products in landfills that contain PFAS. So landfills, prominent potential source of PFAS. And then finally, one thing to really pay attention to is firefighting foam. So we use a lot of different firefighting foams depending on the types of fires, but PFAS in particular are really, really helpful for putting out fires associated with chemical fires, especially like petroleum fires. What it does, remember, PFAS goes to a surface. It's a very surface active. What it does is if you spray a PFAS containing foam on a fire, it sits at a surface of the burning, let's say petroleum in this case. And because it's chemically stable, it doesn't burn up in the fire, but it likes to sit at that surface. And what it does when it sits at that surface on top of our burning petroleum is that it prevents that petroleum from getting oxygen and burning. So for many years, decades, there have been firefighting foams that have contained many different generations of PFAS. So in this regard, if you're worried about what nearby operations, the answer is a little less optimistic. I don't want to freak everybody out, but it is not a hyperbole at all to say that, the farmer field adjacent to your property could be a potential source of PFAS here. Okay. So we've talked about PFAS chemically, we've talked about where it can come. Regulatorily, what is PFAS? And so on the right-hand side, what you see are a number of US regulatory programs. And in terms of forecasting sort of potential issues in the Canadian sphere, I think what we're looking at on the right-hand side in terms of the whack-a-mole approach to PFAS, I hope we can do better as these issues roll out elsewhere. What you see on the right-hand side are different regulatory programs, starting with the top, our hazardous, federal hazardous waste site cleanup regulations, CERCLA or Superfund, regulates 2 compounds. Our national primary drinking water standards pick up 6 compounds. Now, we have individual states, they pick up sometimes more, sometimes less than that, but they'll now have to come in line with the national primary drinking water standards. Then the next set are EPCRA, TSCA, these pick up hundreds to thousands of compounds. Now, they're not all, these 2 happen to be product oriented. So what I want you to get across, the idea here is that we don't have it figured out down here in the States. We're still very much evolving in terms of what we're going to regulate. The other thing to know here is that in the States, and this is represented in the table on the left, is that different states have very different standards, very different opinions about what should be regulated. So on the left column here, we've got a bunch of different PFAS compounds. The next column is the US drinking water standards. These are the maximum contaminant levels. But then I was just in North Carolina last week doing a talk on this. So I pulled up the North Carolina standards. And you can see for the top 4, the North Carolina groundwater standards match the federal standards. But for the next 2, PFOS and PFOA, they're much lower. So the state of North Carolina is saying, we think we need to be more protective here than the US EPA drinking water standards. And then on top of this, the state of North Carolina adds 2 additional compounds that the EPA doesn't have. And what this really represents is this sort of lurching regulatory environment where different states are developing different standards, and there's just not a lot of consistency. So I think we've generally covered this. This is in the slides for you to more study, but if you want, but this really speaks to that idea that there are a lot of federal US regulatory environments, and they're coming at PFAS from a lot of different angles. So I'm not going to belabor that. What I am going to do, though, is touch on state regulatory examples, because just as I think the US direction here may be instructive for how these issues will be handled elsewhere, I think the state examples are instructive for how the US federal government is going to handle PFAS issues. And so there are a couple of examples here. The big one is products. So I told you that a lot of human health exposures are probably coming through, or were historically coming through, products. And what we see is lots of different states taking lots of different actions regarding banning PFAS in products. And if you're paying attention, you go, wait, I thought you just told me PFAS are this broad class and they have different actions. That's absolutely true. So the state of Maine actually right now is getting into a lot of trouble because they said, we're going to ban all products with intentionally added PFAS. And then we went, oh, wait, that doesn't just mean Teflon. Maybe we meant to ban that. But what about Prozac? What about Lipitor? What about components in cars that people aren't being exposed to? So there's a lot of challenge around products and packaging right now. The other that I want to call your attention to is biosolids and the land application of biosolids. And really, that I've sort of laid that out. What that speaks to here is this idea of is PFAS going to be the next asbestos? And in some levels, yes, but we're also seeing this in so many more environments than we ever saw asbestos in, that there's a whole host of potential liabilities there to start to think about. So I'll kick it over to Greg to talk about the scale of those liabilities.
Thanks, Chase. So, as far as the projected bodily injury exposure in the United States due to PFAS, I don't think it's going to be any surprise to anyone in the audience that it's projected to be in the billions of dollars. NYU has a recent study in which they projected the economic burden of PFAS to this country. And those projections came at pretty wide range between 5.5 billion to 63 billion. Those numbers represent NYU's estimates for ultimate medical costs as a result of PFAS exposure and also reduced worker productivity. Maybe a more relevant, or definitely more relevant projection or analysis was recently done, in which the combined defense and indemnity analysts projected the ultimate combined defense and indemnity mass tort PFAS exposure in this country, mass tort being bodily injury, at around $16 billion ultimate. They also projected a 5% chance that $16 billion could increase to $70 billion. Very large numbers, no doubt, but what I will say, and you will be seeing later on in this presentation, those numbers are significantly less than the ultimate that will be spent in this country for asbestos mass tort bodily injury litigation. Next slide, Chase. The real driver right now for PFAS is property damage, and that's kind of unlike asbestos. Asbestos did have a property damage component, but it was not significant in relation to the bodily injury component, which continues to this day and is ongoing, very active litigation in this country. Analysts have predicted the cost to remediate all U.S. groundwater, and this includes private wells as well as public water supplies, at $370 billion to get that water to a 7 part per trillion max contaminant level. And to give you an idea as to what that means, the Clean Water Act that recently added PFOA and PFOS to their standards at a 4 part per trillion or lesser threshold for max contaminant level. Similarly, we here at Roux have provided projections to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Those projections were estimates for public water supplies only. They did not include private wells, but we projected that at 4 PPT, Clean Water Act threshold, it would cost around $32.5 billion to remediate our country's public water supply. So clearly, unlike asbestos, the economic driver for PFAS is property damage, groundwater remediation costs, and how much are those costs going to ultimately, with technology advancing, what are those costs going to ultimately be? And I'm going to segue here and ask Chase a question. So you mentioned, Chase, those North Carolina heightened thresholds for PFAS contamination, and I guess I got a two-pronged question for you. Do we have the technology to meet the standards of these federal and state standards? And is that technology affordable?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. From a technological perspective, yes, we do. The issue is not so much the ability to treat water as it's taken out of the ground. The issue is the cost of doing that. So from a municipal water treatment perspective, it's doable. What's really interesting when you look at the standards that the EPA has put out for the country is that there's opposition to those standards from two very different groups. One group is the American Chemistry Council and other groups that represent chemical manufacturers. And it's probably not shocking to anyone that they oppose more stringent regulations that could cost their, let's say, their constituents money because they manufactured some of these chemicals. What's interesting is they're opposing it, but similarly, the American Water Works Association and related groups are opposing it. And the American Water Works Association represents water purveyors, public water suppliers, and they're opposed to that regulation because they don't see the cost benefit as making sense there, that it is so expensive and the marginal improvement in water quality is relatively low that it's a real sort of fights between sort of very different groups than maybe we're used to against the EPA, where we've got chemical manufacturers and water providers aligning here to challenge some of these regs, but not on a technological basis, on a cost basis or on a cost benefit basis.
Okay. All right, so this is a chart of US PFAS litigation trends, recent ones. And what you can see here is there was a recent uptick in around early 2020 in PFAS litigation. Before that time, there was an initial surge in the mid 2010s. And now we're seeing this second wave, and we believe that there are several reasons why. And many of these have been touched on at some point earlier in the presentation. But first and foremost, the public is becoming increasingly more and more aware and concerned about the PFAS problem we have in this country. It's captured their attention. As Chase has discussed, there have been recent federal and state regulatory drivers regarding PFAS maximum contaminant thresholds. There are also expected future regulatory drivers, which are going to pertain to PFAS. Examples are PFAS was added as two PFAS compounds were added as hazardous compounds in our federal Superfund statute, CERCLA. And I believe I previously mentioned the Clean Water Act, where PFAS was added and maximum contaminant level thresholds were established. There have also been, even though research is medical research regarding injury causation is, at least in my mind's eye, in its earlier stages, there have still been some large PFAS verdicts, some single plaintiff PFAS verdicts in the 8-figure range. More specifically, there have been 2 that I know of. They were involved malignancies, 2 different types of malignancies, 1 kidney and 1 testicular, and they were both single plaintiff verdicts at $50 million. It's no surprise with me telling you that the U.S. plaintiff bar is actively pursuing and trying to develop PFAS litigation. As discussed in my article, the plaintiff bar is pushing the development of this medical research so they can really show causation for all of the, not just malignant injuries that may or may not be associated with PFAS exposure, but the non-malignant injuries as well. They're also in the process, and we're going to get into this a little bit more later, of identifying experts that can tell the PFAS story from the plaintiff bar perspective. The plaintiff bar is also trying to use, and this is very common in U.S. asbestos litigation, they're trying to evoke emotions from juries, namely fear and anger. And in the past, that has been used to get very large asbestos bodily injury verdicts from juries. And I'm quite certain they're going to try to do that in the PFAS context in the future. So if there's no questions on any of this, I think Chase is going to discuss PFAS issues with respect to bodily injury specifically.
Yeah, I'll jump into that, but let me, Danica or Ian, do you guys have, I'm not sure we can see the questions, but if there are questions, I think particularly as we've laid out the nature of the issue, we'd be really happy to tackle them now and emphasize, right, that like questions about, is Teflon something I need to worry about, actually have relevance to the professional aspect here too.
We're watching the chat and the Q&A. There's nothing posted yet, but a good chance. Is there anyone out there with a question or comment? We'll
There's
take
one in the Q&A right now.
Chase mentioned that Maine amended their PFAS ban when they realized people weren't necessarily exposed to all the products that contained the PFAS. Although we may not initially come in contact with a chemical, i.e. a small part within a car battery that we would never touch, would it be correct to say that once products go into a dump and start to break down, we come into contact with it via drinking water?
That's absolutely true as a concept. And that's where, as Maine is working through these issues, what I would expect they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, it's not a blanket ban on PFAS in products, but now we need to know where is everything, where are all of the PFAS compounds in a process, in a in a product so that we can manage the disposal correctly, much in the same way that we manage hazardous waste disposal, right? Where we try and reduce the volume of the waste, and we have very specific frameworks for how to manage that. These are all things that are very much developing right now, and the state of Maine is a perfect example of where it's not simple enough to say you can ban it. It's probably also not simple enough from a regulatory perspective to say, okay, go ahead and put it in. There's going to be a really challenging body of regulatory requirements here to figure out the right way to juggle these. And on top of that, the right landfills to put them in, right? If you're worried about landfill exposures, I can show you dozens of landfills across the country where there's already significant PFAS problems. So this isn't even like a hypothetical. It's real in terms of landfill sources.
Okay, we have a question from Grant McEwen out there. Grant, you've put your hand up if you want to turn on your camera and activate your microphone. Are you able to do that, or are we muting you? Can you do that, Grant? Let me see if
I have them enabled.
Okay. Can you hear me, Ian?
I can. Okay. Yep.
Thank you. My Q&A is not working, so thanks for taking the question. Does a reverse, this is along the Teflon line of questions, does a reverse osmosis system purify your drinking water from PFAS?
Great question. You're actually preempting a question I've got later, but I think it's important. The answer here is yes, right? That there are reverse osmosis systems that you can deploy in your house at your tap that will remove PFAS. The problem with those is, and it's the same problem that the water purveyors are having, those are not free to run. They're not cheap to run. They do work, but now you have to ask questions about when do I know that it stops working and how much testing do I need to do, right? A single PFAS sample might only be a few $100s. So if you take it yourself, not a big deal. If you take it at multiple points in your house and you want to take it every year to verify that your reverse osmosis system is working, costs start to add up. And if you want to hire someone externally to do that, this could be a couple $1,000s a year kind of venture just for a single reverse osmosis system in a house. So reverse osmosis systems can help. Activated carbon systems can help. There are certain ion exchange resins that can help remove PFAS from water supplies. But all of those carry monitoring and sort of disposal costs with it that really parallels what are sort of the big liabilities here for even big water purveyors.
I think if there are no other questions or comments.
There are 3 additional ones in the Q&A.
It's not showing up for me here. Can you
you
see
might have
that?
to click the new post button at the top to make them pop up for you.
There you go.
And if you'd like, I can ask them.
Yeah, please do. I'm having trouble here.
All
Thanks.
right. First, I have 2 questions from Tammy Robinson. I'm just going to kind of ask them both together. So the first one is, has there been research on the climate impact due to PFAS? And the other one is, does Roux have a point of view on the proper or best practice for management of nuclear waste? And is nuclear waste similar to PFAS?
So let me hit the climate issue first. What's really interesting about the climate issue is that there are some compounds, there's some Freon products that meet the definition of PFAS. They are very, very, very different in terms of modes of action than this like PFOS that we talk about. It's actually a perfect example, an example that I use in some context to say, listen, we should worry about Freon 218 because it is an intensely powerful greenhouse gas. It is not a PFAS compound as we think of it in terms of human exposures and human health outcomes, but it meets the same structural requirements. So I think there is a piece of it there, but it's not really what we're worried about when we talk about human exposure, property damage, bodily injury issues. It's more chemical definition issue. And then as far as the nuclear issues, we certainly do nuclear things. In fact, I'm working on a project right now, a large nuclear site cleanup. It doesn't have a lot of PFAS valence to it. There are some minor PFAS implications in the manufacturing processes, but they're sort of not that dissimilar from PFAS implications in manufacturing processes for a lot of high precision equipment.
All right, and then one final question from the Q&A. Are PFAS considered pollutants and thereby subject to the pollution exclusion in many policies?
Oh boy, isn't that the $64,000 question? How about we defer that one, Greg? Because I think you're going to tackle that one later, right?
I'm going to definitely tackle that one later. And what I will say, the answer is going to be it's very policy language, case law, jurisdiction specific, but we're going to talk about a few, actually 3 different pollution exclusion cases under CGL policies and then discuss the outcomes. But yeah, we'll get to that. Absolutely.
Just one other question came in. Does a Berkey water filter system remove PFAS in the water, and what steps can be taken to mitigate risks against PFAS exposure in regards to cooking?
So I've seen some data that says like your garden variety Brita water filter can remove some PFAS. The issue is how much, how long is it effective? Is it removing an amount that's meaningful? That I would say is a wide open question that probably is not well resolved. Reducing PFAS in cooking is interesting because on the sort of water source side of it, you want to make sure if you are going to reduce PFAS in cooking, you want to ensure that your water source is clean. And you can do that with even just a point of use water treatment system, just at your tap. But this sort of mirrors the lots of different places where we could find PFAS, right? One of the questions that's very, very hard for anyone to answer is there PFAS in your water supply? Are there PFAS in the products that you're using? State of Maine, we'll go back to the state of Maine for a second. They did a survey of all the milks on their shelves across the state a couple of years ago. And they found one milk in particular that had a lot of PFAS in it. Not all of them, but one. And that they were able to sort of follow that up through the food chain, and they found one farm that was impacted. I believe this was a biosolids application issue where they were applying biosolids that had PFAS in it that moved through the food chain on site, through the grass, into the cows, into the milk. So the answer to that is very hard to give precisely, because even organic farming practices, we would think of biosolids application as being a great organic process, right? It's recycling, it's avoiding the use of synthetic fertilizers, and yet there's PFAS there. So I don't think there's a fully resolved question on that, or I'm sorry, a fully resolved answer on that.
I think that's it. So we can move on. Thanks.
Very good. So I'm now Greg gave us some of the magnitude of the cost issues. I'm going to jump a little bit into the bodily injury issues. I want to start here. Ian, you had talked about the $670 million settlement with DuPont. This really kicks off our issues and the major litigation. And what you see here are a couple of things, right? From a professional perspective, you see big dollar values associated with this. And if you've insured DuPont, you're probably well aware of these big dollar values. But I think we also want to point out here this idea that the alleged diseases, these probable causal links between PFOA and 6 or 7 or so health outcomes, you can see the variability in these outcomes. Some are very acute, kidney cancer and testicular cancer. Others are much more nebulous. High cholesterol as a human health outcome is something that we're seeing pop up in the literature, but it's a much harder claim to sort of put your finger on in terms of issues. So a lot of these issues that we identified started with the C8 panel, which was 3 scientists, one of which was appointed by DuPont in this 2017 class action settlement that resulted in $670 million of claims. But what we want to think about is how the world is evolving here, right? One of the themes that Greg hit on is bodily injury is probably not going to be the big driver of PFAS issues. Don't get me wrong, it's big, it's just not the biggest piece. But that hinges on not identifying essentially a signature disease with PFAS. Whereas asbestos has mesothelioma, PFAS has a lot of different human health outcomes, and we're just starting to develop and understand those in some context. So what we're looking at here is a number of publications as a function of year related to PFAS. And you can see to the left of the red line is what we had for the CA panel. And science was in its infancy here with respect to PFAS exposure. We have so much more now, and even today, we are still very much developing the scientific understanding and the scientific story. And part of the challenge with that is this. PFAS has a lot of different structures, a lot of different chemicals, right? We've talked about it being thousands of potential chemicals as a class. And each of those chemicals can have different human health endpoints. So what we're looking at here is a chart from ATSDR, which is our toxic substances government agency that works within our Center for Disease Control. And what they're showing here in this chart, I think this is 2021, so it's a little out of date, but you get the idea here how this is evolving. Are a number of human health endpoints and different PFAS compounds. And these dots do not represent negative human health endpoints. All these dots represent are human health endpoints for which that compound has been studied. And what I want you to take away from this is that some compounds like PFOA and PFOS, we've studied a lot of different human health outcomes. Those are prototypical PFAS sort of exposures. But even PFBS, which is a compound that is getting a fair amount of attention as of a couple of years ago, and it's still generally true today, there's more we don't know than we do. So the potential for PFAS to turn into a toxic tort issue on par with asbestos is in part related to the development of the science and the identification of a signature disease. And we'll talk about the diseases that PFAS is associated with, or individual PFAS are associated with. But this really gets to the question, how worried do I need to be, right? You're telling me that there are regulations around this and drinking water, this must be really bad stuff. And there are human health outcomes that are driving EPA's determinations. But I will tell you that if you are a DuPont or 3M worker, what we see here is a chemical exposure charts, right? Different types of exposures on logarithmic scales, right? Each line is 1, 10, 100, 1,000. If you work for 3M or DuPont in the early 2000s, you had big PFAS exposures. But what we see down on the bottom are essentially population surveys across the United States. And exposures to sort of everyday people are very, very different, orders of magnitude different than your sort of industrial exposures. And here we're looking at a couple of in between our manufacturing exposures and our sort of unimpacted, obviously not non-impacted measurements here. These two on the bottom are some environmental sites of certain renown across the country. So there are two things to get across here. One is PFAS exposure is coming from a lot of different places, as represented by that question of how would I keep PFAS out of my cooking? In some regard, I'm not sure you can. But also, those exposures, even to sites, Pease Air Force Base in New Hampshire, not far from Greg and I here, has some exposures, but you can see how they're not on the order of magnitude of 3M and DuPont workers. So very different levels of exposure here. And what's important is very different levels of human health outcomes associated with those exposures. So let me jump over, or let me touch on sort of the human health outcomes that we're most worried about. With respect to drinking water standards, we've got in the United States, we've got liver toxicity, we've got some thyroid issues, we've got some developmental delays. You can see here that these drinking water exposures, this is the formula that EPA uses to calculate the aggregate, the hazard index of exposures for PFAS compounds that's driving U.S. drinking water standards. What we're not looking at here are really acute outcomes. And this is made especially true when we look at PFOA and PFOS. What's driving PFOA and PFOS, you see this is diphtheria up here. And you say, why is this guy talking about diphtheria? All our kids are vaccinated for diphtheria. The human health outcome that is driving EPA standards right now for drinking water is a reduced vaccine response for people who have PFAS in their system. That is, they generate fewer antibodies to diphtheria when they get a diphtheria vaccine. It's not yet clear whether that actually reduces the vaccine efficacy. That's yet another thing to be sorted out. But what I want you to get across, sort of wrestle with here, is that the exposures, like high cholesterol, like vaccine uptake, they're not all acute human health outcomes. One last idea I want to touch on is that we are starting to see, this is contrary to what I told you in the beginning, that PFAS as a class, it's really hard to regulate and understand because each compound varies. We are seeing a lot of litigation around this idea of total organic fluorine. And I will tell you, from my opinion, it makes a technical mistake and it lumps greenhouse gases in with carcinogens and with psychoactive compounds like Prozac. Total organic fluorine says targeted PFAS compounds, this little orange bubble down here, is a subset of total PFAS-related organic fluorine, right? There's some that we can't measure, which is a subset of all organic molecules that have fluorine in them. And we're seeing a lot of claims right now that say, hey, there's organic fluorine in this product. No targeted PFAS that we know of, no PFOS, but there does appear to be organic fluorine. So that must be a bad thing. And the science is out on that to the point where these cases, at least in the US, are getting tossed out of court yet because they haven't proven sort of causation arguments. And I'll let Greg think about this a little bit from a insurance and litigation perspective, I guess.
Sure. Thanks, Chase.
So if I could just interject one quick question, and it was related just a few minutes ago. Mark put forward a question. Reading more and more about similar issues with phthalates, are these PFAS?
Phthalates are not PFAS, but this issue of sort of broad-based exposures with specific compounds having specific negative issues is common in the PCB and dioxin world. It's common in the PFAS world. It wouldn't surprise me if it's common in the phthalates world. It's common in the flame retardant chemical and brominated compound world. So this is a structural issue that we sort of as a regulated society are going to have to start to wrestle with, because it's a real challenge to say all PFAS are bad, all phthalates are bad, all dioxins do the same thing. That's shaky technical footing to base arguments on.
All right, I think I'm up. From a litigation, getting back to TOF, total organic fluorine, pretty easy answer from my perspective. From a litigation defense perspective, the aggregation of PFAS compounds through the TOF test, it has to be heavily resisted by the defense bar. There are thousands of PFAS compounds. I think at one point in time, the US EPA, if I remember correctly, recognized 14,735 compounds that they would consider PFAS. Different PFAS compounds have different health outcomes. Some don't have health outcomes that have been identified yet. The important point is PFAS is not one compound. It is not a monolith. But if we let the plaintiff bar successfully make PFAS into a monolith, pretty much like they tried to do, and were largely successful in doing to a certain point with asbestos litigation, then it is going to dilute a lot of defenses that are available to the PFAS defense bar. Medical causation, varying health outcomes caused by the different PFAS compounds. Those should be highly litigated issues in PFAS litigation. But if PFAS is aggregated through this TOF test, those defenses are largely going to go away, or at least get extremely diluted. Next slide, Chase. Okay, so what are we really talking about comparatively as far as the BI financials comparatively as between asbestos and PFAS? So in a February 2017 Lloyd's article, the projected ultimate defense and indemnity litigation spend for asbestos bodily injury litigation was projected, and this is ultimate, at between $200 to $275 billion. I personally think that is a darn good number. I think we're definitely going to fall within that realm. Clearly, earlier in the presentation, I said PFAS BI was projected at 16 billion, a much smaller number for sure. However, PFAS is in its early stages, and I can guarantee you that in the early stages of asbestos bodily injury litigation, there was no one in the industry that was projecting anywhere close to 200 to 275 billion for asbestos. It was an enigma, asbestos litigation, unlike anything else, and it grew over time, and it became a larger exposure, which really was the sheer size of it was, it took many decades for people to realize the sheer size of asbestos litigation in the United States. So we're in the early stages of PFAS. What does that mean? Right now, asbestos, clearly asbestos has a signature disease. Chase mentioned it, mesothelioma. PFAS currently does not have one, but as Chase has mentioned and I have mentioned, medical science is evolving, and a signature disease may or may not manifest. This is something we definitely all need to monitor if we're involved in PFAS litigation.
Hey, Greg, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. Looks like Jessica has a question.
Okay. Can I see
Can you activate your microphone there, Jessica?
Sorry, that was didn't mean to put that up.
Oh, sorry.
Accident,
Okay.
my bad.
Oh, I was
No
getting all excited. Okay. Well, if you do have a question, Jessica, I'd be happy to answer it.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. So also in the early decades of asbestos litigation, I'm talking in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, most of the asbestos cases were that were tendered, let's say over 90% were non-malignancies. And the way the plaintiff bar extracted maximum value from their pending asbestos claims was they would maybe grab 12, 15 non-malignant claims, and they would wrap them in with a high exposure malignancy claim, say a mesothelioma. And they would extract inflated values from the non-malignancy claims by leveraging the threat of litigation that was posed by the high exposure malignancy claim. Can that happen in PFAS? Well, the science isn't really overly developed, as far as I know, with respect to PFAS causation and non-malignant injuries. But what I will say is there have already been two $50 million single plaintiff PFAS malignancy PFAS verdicts. So clearly, this is something that can happen. These settlement packages extracting inflated values for really smaller non-malignant claims, something we should all definitely be aware of. Next slide, Chase. So what are we talking about as far as a potential PFAS plaintiff pool? And I'm going to break this down from as far as the U.S. perspective. So first off, there are blood tests that are now available in our country, presumably in Canada as well, that you can check your PFAS levels, multiple compounds in your bloodstreams. They're very affordable. I believe they're $300 to $350. Spoiler alert, it's estimated, at least in our country, and I would be surprised if Canada was much different, that 98% of US citizens have PFAS in their bloodstreams currently. So simple math, I believe the US population is 342 million people. 98% of that number, if I did my math right, is 335 million. So what that means is that the United States has 335 million potential domestic PFAS plaintiffs. Pretty large number. In fact, a larger number than asbestos, which was primarily a commercial exposure. But since PFAS has private applications, and in addition to commercial or industrial ones, the potential plaintiff pool is actually larger. Next slide, Chase. So in summary, or just kind of a good summary for us about bodily injury and takeaways, extremely large plaintiff pool, and at least in the United States, potentially 335 million PFAS plaintiffs. There is no signature disease identified yet for PFAS yet, like mesothelioma, but medical research on causation is developing, and that needs to be heavily monitored. And folks need to be keep themselves abreast of recent developments or upcoming developments in that area. There have already been, I've mentioned this already 2 or 3 times, adverse single plaintiff PFAS bodily injury verdicts as in plural, of $50 million, despite the fact that the science is still, medical science regarding causation is still in its developmental stages. There is going to be a battle of experts, in my opinion, in this litigation. My suggestion to anyone that is on the defense side of PFAS litigation is retain your own experts, grow them, train them, get them ready. Bad science, at least in the United States, will be admitted by judges, and it will be allowed to be placed in front of juries. You need to have a counter expert so you can fight the good fight, and particularly with respect to causation. Also, like the asbestos plaintiffs bar, plaintiff attorneys are going to try to motivate PFAS juries by fear and anger, using fear and anger. Be aware of that. PFAS is not a monolith. Resist TOF test aggregation. That is a huge concern of mine. And then just be aware of the settlement packages where the plaintiff bar are trying to wrap potentially low or no value non-malignant cases in with malignancies and trying to extract inflated values out of them. So those, I think those are the primary, like the 5 big points that we should take away from PFAS in its current stages from a bodily injury perspective. If we have any questions, we can answer them now, or we can move on to property damage. Okay.
Alistair Campbell has a question. Alistair?
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Chase and Greg. Super interesting so far, and I don't want to get in the way of the property part of the discussion. But my sense of the kind of soap opera as it unfolded for tobacco and for asbestos was a critical part of the case that was successfully made by the trial bar was around, you knew this was bad, and you still did more of it. You were aware of the health risks, and you continued to put them in your products and sell them to unwitting consumers. To the extent that PFAS is not a monolith, are there certain compounds where that case of you knew would be more compelling, and as a result, certain compounds that would be more exposed to bad trial outcomes?
It's a really great point. I would answer that less in the context of specific compounds and more in the context of specific manufacturers and industries. In that regard, it's absolutely true that there are big issues if you're 3M, if you're DuPont, if you're some of the AFFF, the aqueous film forming foam manufacturers. You don't have to go farther than, there was a ProPublica article a month or 2 months ago about 3M allegedly silencing a whistleblower, right? Like those kinds of arguments are very, very powerful arguments for the big manufacturers. What's interesting about this, though, is that some of those arguments will filter down in the sense that these are our big manufacturers and they were selling chemicals. The argument may evolve as you sort of move down the food chain, though. It will move down the food chain from you were 3M, let's use this ProPublica article as an example. You were 3M and you silenced the whistleblower, to, hey, you didn't ask the relevant questions about 3M, right? So you can see like what we expect is that this will move down the food chain. Now, the farther out you get in the sort of the industrial food chain here, the harder it's going to be to make those connections. Because I will tell you that I think there are a lot of industrial users out there who didn't even know that there was PFAS in what they were handling and managing. They bought this product because it had a particular property, not because it had or didn't have PFAS. But they're going to be challenged on, should you have known that there was PFAS? Did you ask sufficient questions? So those arguments dilute, but I don't think they go away regardless of where you are sort of in the industrial application chain.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll touch a little bit more on that later on, but I think Chase's answer was a little bit comprehensive, but I'm going to circle back later on in one of my slides a little bit more on that. But because we're going to get into, it dovetails with the expected and intended coverage defense too. Yeah, if any more questions aren't, any more no? You want to move on to property damage, Chase?
Sure, I'm going to move on to property damage. And what I'm going to tell you is that this is a little less developed sort of discussion than the bodily injury pieces, because it's in some ways it's more facially obvious. This is an analysis of potential PFAS presumptive contamination sites in the United States from a couple of years ago, 50 or 60,000. There was a study put out by the United States Geological Survey a week ago that said they estimated something like 20% of Americans were drinking water from PFAS impacted aquifers. And the issue here is that we're not, because PFAS had so many different applications between firefighting and military applications and sources from wastewater treatment plants and disposal practices, it's so broadly utilized throughout industry that the number of contamination sites is enormous. And I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to go from this being, 60 or so thousand contamination sites, excluding some major factors, right? Some major contamination sites, by the way, to, oh, wow, this is going to be a big cleanup issue. And what we're dealing with in terms of the cleanup is that we don't have a lot of well-developed remedial technologies. And this actually goes back to that water treatment question. What do I do if I've got PFAS at my tap? Can I remove it through reverse osmosis? So interestingly enough, there's field implemented technologies that we know work. There's reverse osmosis for you. But what you're looking at here are, in terms of cleaning it up in the environment, all we have are various versions of expensive pump the groundwater and treat it. We can also excavate soil, but once it's in a really big groundwater footprint, all we've got are expensive pump and treat options of various forms. There is one idea out there that's been started to be accepted about, if you've got a source area, you might be able to control it by essentially putting a barrier wall around it that absorbs PFAS. But at the end of the day, what we don't have is a reliable way to destroy PFAS when it's broadly based in groundwater. And what that means is that we're going to have to pump and treat this for a long time. So if you're doing it for your own house, how expensive is it? Adding a activated carbon treatment system to your house might be a few $1,000s, and you've got to monitor it for, PFAS on an ongoing basis. So maybe that's $5,000 or $10,000 worth of initial cost and a couple grand a year. Okay, maybe that doesn't break the bank, but you can imagine you multiply that by 20% of the US population, and one would assume a comparable percentage of the Canadian population. You can see how shockingly expensive this is going to be. So added to this is the idea that, and I'm just going to touch on this for a second, and then we're going to move on. This idea of forever chemicals, just file away that there are compounds in the environment, PFOA and PFOS. Those are our sort of prototypical groundwater contaminants that things like firefighting foam can degrade into. As we moved away from these legacy PFAS compounds to these more modern ones, we said, hey, we're going to use these more modern ones. They're less toxic. That's great. It turns out that a lot of those degrade back into PFOA or PFOS or related perfluoroalkyl acids, which have sort of the human health profile that we're worried about from a drinking water perspective. So it's not an exaggeration to say we are creating more PFAS sites even right now, because a lot of these firefighting foams, for example, that use these next generation compounds are out there in commerce. And as you're managing things with insureds, it's a really important question to ask them, like, okay, you say you don't have any regulated PFAS, but do you have any non-regulated PFAS that could degrade? And if you want to chat about this later, I'm certainly happy to, but just file away the idea that this forever chemical designation is only partly true. The last property damage piece that I want to get across to you, and I'm going to get across to you visually, is maybe a slight upside if you're a carrier, and that is the ability to differentiate and potentially subrogate claims. So when we're looking at hundreds and thousands of potential compounds, let's say at a site I can measure several dozen PFAS compounds. What that lets me do is develop a chemical fingerprint. And there is the potential of using these chemical fingerprints to separate sources. So here's a site that I worked on, or an anonymized version of a site that I worked on, where up in the pink was a firefighting foam application. And this particular product had what we'll call the blue compounds. They were carboxylic acids, a subgroup of PFAS that we're worried about. And the allegation was that, hey, there was foam applied here, and that PFAS has now impacted this entire neighborhood. By the way, if we step back and we think about each one of these being thousands of dollars a year to maintain, that you can see how those costs add up, because it goes away, or it never goes away, right? These costs run in perpetuity. So the allegation was, my client's foam application in pink was responsible for all of this down here. And it turns out that that's actually not true. When you look at the individual compounds in this yellow blob here, you see all of those yellow compounds, all the sulfonic acids. And what that indicates is that there's a different PFAS source. And this is a simplified example that I very obviously cherry picked, because it's pretty straightforward to explain. They're not all this easy, but it does get across the idea that if you are managing property claims, do not take it at face value that just because your insured was responsible for this PFAS, they are necessarily responsible for that PFAS right next door, across the street, or even commingled with their plume. And there are tools to help start to think about separating responsibility there. But they're big, expensive, and complicated fights. So not only is the liability big, but now the defense costs associated with challenging these are also going to be big. So some good news, maybe some bad news on the property front. We'll pause there, and then if there are questions, we'll hit those, and if not, we'll turn it over to Greg to close it out on sort of claim considerations.
There is a question from Sharon, and it's tagging on Alistair's earlier point about you should have known. So how will mandatory regulatory reporting of PFAS in a company's supply chain impact litigation?
This is a juicy question. The U.S. is being aggressive about this. So I talked about TSCA. TSCA is a chemical use regulations. And one of the things that EPA did through TSCA last year, was they asked a group of industrial users and manufacturers not to just report PFAS from today forward, but actually to go back in their supply chain all the way to 2013 and explain what they did, what chemicals they used. Now, in 2013, there were no regulations about what they could or couldn't use with respect to PFAS. And yet they're being asked to go all the way back in their supply chain. And so I think there's a natural limit to that, in terms of you can only go back so far and the data just doesn't exist anymore. But there are strong regulatory and civil litigation efforts to try and roll that back and ask those questions about what did you know and when did you know it. And the regulatory hook there is a particularly powerful one, because now all that data is going to become publicly available information. So different states are doing that in different ways, but TSCA federally has got a lot of teeth in it to roll things back. Okay, Greg, you want to close us out with some claims considerations here?
Sure. Thanks, Chase. So our presentation, no surprise, has been heavily focused on commercial general liability coverages. Those are the policies, the types of policies that we're generally going to see involved in PFAS tenders, PFAS claim tenders, whether it be from the property damage or bodily injury perspective. But we are seeing other types of policies that are getting tendered, and I wanted to briefly discuss them with you. We have seen some director and officer shareholder suits. I believe they're currently ongoing, and those allegations are really focused on one or two things. It was the failure of the company's senior management to disclose known PFAS liabilities. This is getting into the prior knowledge questions that have been asked. And also, when management knew about these PFAS liabilities, their failure to mitigate damages. So be aware of that if anyone is involved in the handling of director and officer policies. Other policies we've seen tendered are pollution or environmental liability policies. Keep in mind, if you do have tenders under these policies, first off, these policies are designed to cover environmental pollution, but they're typically not occurrence-based. They're claims made and reported, which is a smaller grant in coverage. The claim, it needs to be made and reported during the policy period. Also, these policies have retroactive dates where pollution must have occurred before the after the retroactive date. My mistake. And if you can see from the embedded reference chart, PFAS has been around for decades. So for folks handling pollution or EIL policy PFAS claims, be mindful that you're going to have opportunities for coverage defenses using your retroactive date on PFAS tenders. Other type of policies that we're seeing, employer liability. In the United States, employees can sue their employer directly in some instances, or in other instances, defendants that are sued by the first party employee will third party in that plaintiff's employer into the litigation. In the United States, if an employee directly sues their employer, those litigations are typically barred by the applicable workers' compensation statute in our country, unless it can be shown that the employer's conduct was intentional or grossly negligent. So be mindful of that if you have any employer liability PFAS suits. And just the last thing I want to say on this slide, if you get a new tender and you're handling perhaps legacy policies, look into your prior policy settlements. Those need to be explored. You may have language in the policies, broad language that may preclude future PFAS exposures. And also keep in mind, if you have a Washington state claim in the United States, Washington state generally does not recognize policy buybacks. Next slide. So getting into the pollution exclusion and PFAS question, it's really been a mixed bag. So these are cases with respect to CGL policies where the PFAS, the pollution exclusion was in play for PFAS litigation. The first one was Colony Insurances. It was a 2021 opinion. This involved firefighters using AFFF firefighting foam in conducting their job responsibilities. They were using it as intended. What it was intended to fight fires, and that's what it was being used for. The court in this case held that the pollution exclusion in the policies at issue was limited to traditional environmental pollution. And since this was not traditional environmental pollution in the court's view, because it was firefighters using a product to fight fires, the court implicitly read what, at least my words, a products exception into the pollution exclusion. And the pollution exclusion was not used as a basis to deny coverage. In Wolverine, also a 2021 decision, that involved the sudden and accidental pollution exclusion, which in domestic U.S. policies was in play from around 1970 to 1985. So in this instance, the court held, and this is going to be a little confusing when you hear it, that there was a duty to defend, notwithstanding the sudden and accidental pollution exclusion, until it was shown that the PFAS discharges were intentional. Now, the exception to the exclusion is sudden and accidental, so you're probably asking, what does intentional conduct have to do with that? And the short answer is many U.S. courts have refused to acknowledge that the sudden and accidental, the sudden in the term sudden and accidental has a temporal component. So they have essentially, courts in some instances have revised the exception to the sudden and accidental pollution exclusion by holding that that exception, which reads sudden and accidental, really means intentional discharges. So the last case I want to discuss is Tanaga. It's a 2022 case where there was the court held there was not a duty to defend. In this instance, the insured heavily argued that PFOA and PFOS, two very common PFAS compounds, were not considered pollutants. The court disagreed. They held that PFOA and PFOS in the context here were pollutants, and the insurer, in this case AIG, was allowed to use the pollution exclusion to deny coverage. I think the takeaway here is that in pollution exclusion cases, at least in the United States, they are going to be highly jurisdiction specific, highly policy language specific, and highly fact specific. So I think they're going to be ad hoc determinations depending on the pollution exclusion you have, your facts, and the jurisdiction that would be the appropriate choice of law. Next slide, Chase. All right, this is kind of one of the, at least from my perspective, one of the scary slides. So legacy CGL policies, CGL has been the focus here, at least for me. They typically have products aggregates, and those products aggregates are usually a combined products hazard completed operations aggregate. These legacy CGL policies typically do not have general aggregate limits. So claims that fall outside the products aggregate in these legacy policies are only subject to the policy's per occurrence limit. For example, if you have a PFAS premises claim, that would be outside of the CGL policy product aggregate. It would just be limited to per occurrence. And why is this important? Well, in some U.S. jurisdictions, frankly, many of them, the courts have ruled that each individual plaintiff is a separate occurrence. So in those instances, your policy may in effect be a bottomless ATM. And that's the scary bad news, because the occurrence limit will in effect be replenished for each and every new PFAS plaintiff that tenders a claim. Next slide, Chase. So just some general coverage considerations I want to go through here real quickly, and then some suggestions on how you should be preparing. As far as coverage trigger in the CGL context, I think that it's going to be adoption of some variation of a long tail continuous trigger. That's no surprise. Just remember that PFAS is not a monolith. There are thousands of compounds, and each PFAS compound may have a different trigger period. These will be highly fact-intensive determinations. Contribution and subrogation opportunities, I think they will be much more present than they were in asbestos litigation. Those opportunities, even if they existed in the beginning of asbestos litigation, they really weren't heavily pursued and haven't been heavily pursued in recent decades. But unlike asbestos, there are many different PFAS compounds, and those compounds cause different injuries. So there will be subrogation and contribution opportunities available for defendants. They will be, once again, highly fact intensive, but I believe those opportunities will be available. The other thing, or the last thing on this slide I want to talk about, is duty to defend. In some of your CGL policies, you have, the insuring agreements often, there's a duty to defend, sometimes lawsuits or sometimes claims in lawsuits. Many of them, the CGL insuring agreements only defend lawsuits, only a duty to defend lawsuits. So if you have one of those policies and you have a governing regulator, whether it be the US EPA or the state equivalent, that issues an order with regards to PFAS cleanup or investigation, but that regulating entity has not filed litigation, they have not filed a lawsuit, you may not have a duty to defend that under your CGL coverage that matter. And then you would get into what the insured does do if you deny a duty to defend, and you may have a voluntary payment defense that's available to you later on if they in turn come after you for indemnity. Next slide, Chase. Non-accumulation clause. Those are recognized in the United States in jurisdictions that have joint and several all sums rulings, where you can essentially spike one policy tower in a legacy or long tail context and go up through that tower without consideration to other triggered years. Now, in those jurisdictions, the non-cum clause, say that an insurer has 5 policies in play, all triggered, and 5 policy limits that are part of the exposure. The non-cum clause can be used to limit that exposure to 1 policy limit. So be mindful of those opportunities. Getting back, this was mentioned earlier, the expected and intended defense. There was a recent, and Chase generally mentioned it very briefly, there was a recent New Yorker article, and it appeared to show that an entity had knowledge that PFOA was in their workers as early as the 1970s, and it was causing adverse health effects. Now, can that be used to evidence, that information be used to incite anger in a jury? Absolutely. However, it also can be used to potentially form the basis for an expected and intended coverage defense, and perhaps an insurer can deny coverage. Similarly, known loss, lack of fortuity. You need fortuity for a valid insurance policy. So if you have an entity out there that has been hiding known health outcomes, known bad health outcomes for PFAS exposure, and they've been hiding that for decades, there may be a known loss argument as well. Notice considerations was noticed timely. In the United States, many jurisdictions require a showing of prejudice by the insurer in order to deny for late notice. And lastly, but not least important, PFAS exclusions. I believe there's only one that our insurance services office came out with. It was in June of 2023. A lot of these PFAS exclusions that at least I'm bumping into are manuscripted. And once again, keep in mind, 14,735 PFAS compounds, more and more are becoming part of the public consciousness. If you are looking at a manuscripted PFAS exclusion in your policies, or you're drafting one or involved in the drafting one, make sure it's sufficiently broad to cover every PFAS compound that you think may be at issue. So be very mindful of that. So how to prepare. Next slide. First off, I think that, and this is really kind of focused on folks involved with the handling of insurance claims departments. You should evaluate not only your open, but your closed hazardous waste accounts, at least domestically here in the U.S. And here's why. The U.S. EPA has a 5-year re-review period for closed hazardous waste sites. And due to the inclusion of PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, our federal Superfund statute, those re-reviews may result in sites that were closed by the U.S. EPA being reopened. So obviously that would cause your claim file to be reopened as well. So if you're going to be assessing these exposures, be mindful of your closed accounts. Analyze your coverage defenses. Pollution exclusion law is ongoing. It's very jurisdiction and policy specific. And also be mindful of your PFAS exclusion endorsements, and make sure if they're manuscripted that they're sufficiently broad to cover and exclude what you want them to exclude. You obviously need to establish and at least evaluate the necessity of initial reserves and possibly notify your reinsurers. Due to the unique nature of the PFAS as a toxicant, you need to assess your staffing needs. I would suggest that you centralize and standardize your PFAS claim handling, perhaps into one claim department. And similarly, you standardize and tailor your claim administration and data collection needs for PFAS claims. As an example, one domestic insurer recently was very concerned about collecting relevant PFAS information data at the advent when a claim was tendered, so that they could go back 2, 3, 5, 10 years from now and harvest that data and try to find certain trends. And they wanted to capture the data up front so they wouldn't be trying to capture it and go backwards retroactively and capture it at a later time. So be mindful of that as you're setting up your claim departments, as you're setting up your your PFAS claim intake forms, as you're recording data. Probably the third time I've said this, but please, if you're on the defense side, fight the TOF test acceptance. We cannot let PFAS be aggregated into a monolith. It simply is not. And develop your own litigation injury causation experts. I believe that the litigation is going to develop, if it hasn't already, into a battle of experts, and it's just going to be who is the most credible expert. So those are my recommendations for what you should do to prepare.
One last
Ian,
quick question, if we could throw this in. Yep, sorry, Alistair, is that
I
you?
was just going to kick it over to you
sorry.
real quick.
It's
Sorry, we
Yep.
ran a minute long there.
That's okay. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. So another question from we love to answer all the questions here. So from Esther, what alternatives to PFAS are being developed for use in consumer products and industrial applications? There's a short answer to that.
There is a short answer to that, at least in some industries. So aqueous film forming foam, which is a big source of PFAS, there are now some approved fluorine-free foams on the market. A lot of personal care products, we use makeup as an example, are getting away from fluorinated compounds. Now, you sort of have a whack-a-mole question, but they're trying to get away entirely, to Greg's point about total organic fluorine, entirely away from organic fluorine. But there are some applications where it really just is the best product. So then it becomes a risk management and mitigation issue. Are we going to put it in the car battery because it has to be there, but we're not going to put it in the steering wheel, right? Those types of questions. I would be shocked if it was removed entirely from the stream of commerce. It is too valuable of a compound, but we are finding replacements in some places.
One final question, is there a Canadian counterpart to Roux?
There is not. We do the science side of it. It turns out doesn't change that much across the border. It's the regulatory side a little bit. So we do some work in Canada for some Canadian carriers. We're certainly happy to advise, and especially in the technical or the claims management issues. The regulatory specifics, that's going to be a little harder for us to help you with, but we can certainly partner with local folks who do know.
Maybe I had a question about the slides, and yes, absolutely, everybody's going to get a copy of the slide deck, so look forward to that. This is probably a great point to stop conversation, and thank you to Chase and Greg. Great primer on PFAS, scary as hell, and this kind of meets with these webinars. We like to profile emerging risk issues, and this is certainly one in Canada. We benefited from your experience in the US, so thanks very much for being on the line today and joining us and providing great information. And I'm going to ask Danica to
appreciate you having us.
quickly
And don't hesitate to reach out. Our contact info is in the slides. So.
Absolutely, and I'll make note of that to our members in the follow-up that you're certainly open to continued dialogue. So thanks very much for that. Just looking ahead, I just want to quickly a view into our next Risk Officers Forum meeting is on November 28th. We're going to have Obaid Rahman from Definity. He's going to talk about C-suite perspective on ERM. Peter Askew from Guy Carpenter and Matt Wolf from Aon are going to talk about the current reinsurance environment and renewal season around the corner. And then my colleagues, Grant and Judy, and I are going to talk about the latest issue of Why Insurers Fail. We looked at analyzing failure clusters and Canada's ability to respond. So you're going to get tomorrow, all registrants here, a copy of the satisfaction survey. We look forward to your feedback. That helps to make for better broadcasts in future, and we want your ideas on speakers and topics. So certainly do provide that to us, and wish you a happy Halloween. And we will see you hopefully online, everybody, on November 28th at our next and last forum meeting of the year. Thanks for being here today, and take care. Bye for now.